We're going to go ahead and take a look at lesson 4 or 5. This is on compound and simple interest. So we're going to look at situations where we examine how money grows or how debt increases. And we do that looking at, of course, here's the introduction, so you can go ahead and read that on your own. But the first type of interest we talk about is what we call simple interest. And here you can see in this example here, very basic. If you have $100 in some what we call certificate or deposit, and you have it over some interest rate, you have $100, so that would be called your principal. At the end of 1 year, with the simple interest, you take 5% of 100, and then you add that on, and your principal was 100, and then your how much interest you make was $5. So there's some key words there: your term, your interest, right? And then you're also what your percent is. So you have all these kind of numbers that you need to be paying attention to. And so to calculate simple interest, it's straightforward. You take your principal value, multiply by your interest rate in decimal form, which is important, times the amount of time the principal's invested, and this is years. And so we would say that is I equals P times R times T. Principal times your interest rate times your time. And so you see multiple equations here for future value of simple interest. Your future value, which we call A, which is use that variable for future value, is your principal plus your interest. Now, if you substitute I, right, we have the interest as principal times rate times time. We end up with a new equation for your future value. Do a little algebra, you can see you end up with the second equation. So these are equivalent. These two are equivalent equations. They just, whichever one's easier for you to use. And so here's the first problem situation looking at simple interest, 2%, $1,000. And so you can see how this grows. I'm using the A equals P times 1 plus RT equation. And so you can see this is the amount of money in the account after certain years. This is again an example of simple interest. Most banks don't use this type of interest anymore. We'll talk about compound in the video in a little bit. And so looking at this over, that's 1 through 5 years, looking at that same situation for 20, 40, 60, 80, 100 years, you can see the growth here. And then after you have these values, if you make a plot, you see it turns up to be in a straight line, which it's a linear. You can see it turns in a line graph. And again, that's based off of simple interest. If you're going to have a general formula, we have that already. A equals P plus PRT. Or again, you could look at this equation here. But if you look carefully, you can see it's pretty much a linear equation. A equals 1,000 plus 20T based off of the growth. It was growing $20 every year. If you look at this one, it's going up by 20. It's like a rate of change. So that is an example of simple interest. And then of course we have a few other examples here that you can see here. And this is simple interest looking at your problems here. You have your principal amount times your interest rate times years. And again, this would be your interest owed. So this also works for debt, credit cards, and when you borrow, have loans. And so here you can see it's pretty straightforward looking at my calculations that I have for this section here. This last question is, I think, the hardest one, where you have to calculate the rate. Notice an equation set up. You're given certain values, how much your future value is, what your investment was, or not your future, what your interest was, not future value. That's your I. And you can see you end up with solve an equation and get the rate. That would have been the hardest question. That's it for simple interest.